Just ahead, there's another edition of the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and in the Orlando area of Tuff TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political analyst Al Spry. We got an interesting story about a native Floridian who you're going to know more about if you don't already.
Our guest is going to be a 5-time New York Times best-selling author. But we're going to ask you to stay tuned. We're not going to tell you just who it is, but it's a big story about a big player in many, many things in Florida. Stay put. The Florida Roundtable begins following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and in the Orlando area of Tuff TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political analyst Al Spry. Great to be here, Reagan, with you, of course, and with our audience both on TV, Tuff TV 38, and across our 80 radio stations all over the state of Florida on Florida Roundtable on the Florida News Network. If you can get us in Orlando, we highly recommend you check us out, and you can see us do our thing on TV Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays at 9 a.m. Tuff TV 38 is available with an HD antenna, which you can pick up at Radio Shack and other places like that. And if you want to get it on cable, well, right now it's on the Summit Broadband cable system, but if you want to get it on Bright House or DirecTV, just call your cable operator or your satellite TV
tell
operator.
them so.
Tell them I want my Tuff TV. I'm going to come down there. I'm going to get in somebody's face, like Fred Levin.
Yeah, there you go.
Who's going to be our guest on about Fred Levin.
Yeah.
Not him as, although it would be great to have him on as well.
It would be fun to
Maybe
have
we
him,
can have a follow-up interview. All right, so if you're listening to this show this weekend, the election is over. However, we tape this show a few days ahead of time, so we don't know how things are going to turn out. However, on next weekend's show, we will have a gentleman who is going to dissect all the races with us, Reagan.
Ed Pasquale, a former state GOP chairman, practicing attorney in the Fort Lauderdale area. You've seen him on Fox. He's been on CNN, national reputation, and he's going to spend the entire program with us next week. One thing I am very glad of, Al, and that we can safely say has happened. All of those horrible ads have gone away.
Yeah, it was hard for me to watch football last Sunday because every other ad was a political ad. Mostly, really, I saw Kristen Scott ads, one after the other.
A montage.
Every break.
Yeah.
About how terrible each of these guys is.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? I voted for somebody else because I don't want to vote for these terrible guys. So I don't know how much this negative advertising works, really. Yeah. We happen to have had Adrian Wiley come on, and I like Adrian Wiley, and he didn't have, of course, the campaign funds that the other two guys had. Speaking of these campaign funds, there's 4 lessons to be learned here.
All right.
This is a record-setting governor's race. Number 1, money matters so much to reach so few. Never before have 2 campaigns spent so much money to move the needle so little. Scott started his TV campaign in March, but the real start of the ad blitz came in July when Christ went on TV also. It was a margin of error race. Christ up by an average of 2.2 percentage points, which is really nothing.
Right.
It's within the error.
Margin of error.
Right.
Yeah.
So Christ leading by an average of 0.6 percentage points after nearly $77 million in TV spending by Scott and his GOP allies, and $40 million by Christ and his allies. Now, of course, you listening to this show know who won. We don't yet. So when you hear it, call us and tell us, because we really would like to find out. And but the state has become so polarized, Reagan, that future governors may consider themselves lucky if they ever draw approval ratings of more than 45%. If Scott spent, but of course it doesn't mean that money doesn't matter. If Scott had spent 3 times as much as Christ instead of twice as much, he likely would be heading more comfortably into re-election if in fact he did get reelected. So the second lesson, early voting has redefined Florida elections, Reagan. Mm-hmm. The trend has been building over the past 10 years. It looks like this will be the first statewide general election where the majority of votes are cast before Election Day, which is how it turned out to be.
The primary came out that way, as a matter of fact. The percentages of early voting and the absentee ballots tilted to the majority.
The third thing is the uncertain risk of negativity. Florida's have never seen a race so negative. The constant attacks left marks on the candidates. And the fourth is convenient voting makes a difference. It's the first election in several cycles where Republican leaders in Tallahassee did not try to make it harder to vote. And that's in part because their efforts backfired in 2012.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to take a pause along the network line. Our special guest this day is Josh Young. He is a New York Times best-selling author, and he has written a biography of Fred Levin, and it's called And Give Up Showbiz. This is the man from Pensacola who took on big tobacco in Florida and won. And my goodness, is he a controversial lawyer, but an exciting and thrilling story, and one we think you're going to enjoy. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And we'll continue our conversation in a moment. We're back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And Al, as promised, we are joined at this point by five-time New York Times bestselling author Josh Young. And he's got a brand new book out here. It is called And Give Up Show Business. It is a story of how Fred Levin beat big tobacco, avoided two murder prosecutions, became a chief of Ghana, earned Boxing Manager of the Year, and transformed American law. And this man is a native of Pensacola, Florida, and therein lies our tie to this whole thing. Josh, welcome to the Florida Roundtable.
Well, thanks for having me.
To get started, why don't you go ahead and take the first minute here and just tell us a little bit about yourself and your personal background.
Well, I started out as a journalist many, many years ago covering professional tennis. I then covered the entertainment business for the New York Times and Esquire magazine, later covered politics for George magazine, and then in about 2000 began writing biographies and autobiographies. And this is my 16th book to come out. So,
wow.
Very fortunate.
Really? Well, I mean, aside the subtitle there, all that information in there, obviously.
Right. You don't need to read the book now. It's all there.
Well, that's what we do here. We give a synopsis.
Yeah. What pointed you toward Fred Levin and made you decide that a book was necessary about this?
Well, I'd always been fascinated by trial lawyers when I grew up. I was a big sports fan. I love the Boston Celtics. I love John Havlicek. I love the Miami Dolphins, Bob Greasy and Larry Zonka. But I also love trial lawyers. I loved F. Lee Bailey growing up. I just thought, he was action. Everything he did was outstanding. I would run to Time magazine to see if there was some case that he was trying or something he was doing that was controversial to read about him. So I held that thought over the years, and I'd always wanted to write a book about a trial lawyer, and I could never really find the right one. I wanted somebody who had all of those great qualities of a trial lawyer, was a great lawyer in the courtroom, but also was that bombastic, egomaniacal, sort of semi-crazy person. And I was fortunate enough that a friend of mine, Wayne Rogers, whose book I wrote, knew Fred's law partner and got me an introduction.
What drew you to Fred specifically? What did you like about him? What did you not like about him? What made him a compelling character to you?
I mean, Fred is a unique American figure, and I think it changed over time. Initially, I was attracted to the fact that he was this sort of egomaniacal, bombastic lawyer who had amazing success, 75 verdicts or cases settled over $1 million. At one time, the largest legal settlement ever in a train derailment case. Of course, big tobacco, which we can get into, bringing them to their knees. But then, as I started to get to know Fred, it really became about who he was as a person and his own personal failings, which he readily admits. He was a horrible family man. He provided for his family financially, but he was never there emotionally. And as he started to examine these things, really a full person came into life, a really unique American figure, and it made the story for me much, much richer.
Fred was a party kid. Almost didn't make it to law school.
Yes, he was, going all the way back to his high school days and then all through college. I mean, he was the happy-go-lucky, naughty by nature, always drunk party kid, and he barely graduated from the University of Florida. He escaped with a 2.0 by going to summer school after his senior year, and he then wanted to continue partying and going to football games. So he thought, I'll go to law school. His brother had gone there, and he said, this is to buy myself 3 more years on campus. Well, everything changed when he got to law school from the very first day. He walked in, and the dean said, look to your right, look to your left. Those guys won't be here in 3 years. And Fred realized that his reputation had preceded him, and he was regarded as a party boy, but also as stupid. And he said to himself, you know what? This is serious. I got to get busy. And so for the next 3 years, he didn't go to a single party, and he didn't go to a single football game, and he ended up graduating 3rd in his class.
It's interesting. I guess law schools weren't as competitive as they are today because 2.0 won't get you into any law school nowadays.
No, it is very interesting, and it was very much a product of its time in the 50s. What they would do is they would admit anyone could get into law school, and then they would simply flunk out 2/3 of the class. So literally, Fred's class, 2/3 of the people who started didn't finish. So they would just cannibalize the class over the course of those 3 years. Obviously, now it's the opposite.
Well, yeah, I guess you were getting better quality lawyers at the end of that process. I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean,
because you're getting a lot of lawyers now that are just mediocre and not really making any money or doing anything. So interesting.
That's absolutely correct. As everyone knows, most law today is transactional law, and lawyers. Not to say push paper, but banking law, finance law, and a lot of those people become lawyers because they can pass the LSAT, score high, and do well in college, and then basically once you get into law school, unless you completely mess up, you're going to get out.
Right.
Now, here's a kid that grows up in Pensacola in the shadows of the Great Depression, World War II. Father's a pawnbroker, and he becomes one of the wealthiest lawyers ever. And yet we find some of the roots of this in personal injury cases.
Yes. Fred became a personal injury lawyer at a time when it was a really nascent practice in the 1950, early 50s. And he became a personal injury lawyer because he was Jewish, and the Jewish lawyers were not hired by the corporate blue blood firms, so they had to go off on their own, and they had to practice the kind of law that the big firms didn't want to practice, and that meant divorces and plaintiffs' law, ambulance chasing. The cases were very small then. It was not anything like we see today on television, people advertising for accidents and the drug companies abusing their position and poisoning people. So it was a very, very different practice of law then. And fortunately for Fred, he got in on the ground floor. So he became really, really good at this. And as plaintiff's law became more lucrative, he was already in a unique position that he was pretty much one of the best in the country at it.
And we should point out that Fred is still active today in his late 70s.
Yes, he is. In fact, he won a big ATV rollover case last year in Alabama. It was one of those 3-wheel terrain vehicles you ride around on the beach rolled over, and they had never lost a case in court on a liability claim, and he won that case in Alabama. He then went a couple of weeks ago to try a similar case in California that has now been continued to January. So he'll go back and try that case in January.
Where does the title of your book come from?
The title of the book, And Give Up Showbiz, comes from something that Fred said to me in a story he told me. He initially told me in our first meeting, he said, being a lawyer to him, there's nothing greater than except wearing the uniform, because law is all show business. And I thought, well, that's kind of a neat thing, so it's fun and people will get that. Well, toward the end of our time together, he told me a story, and I asked him, similar question to you just said, well, he's still doing this. Why are you still doing this, Fred? You've made all this money, you've got a big house and a nice boat. Why don't you just go sail around the Gulf of Mexico? And he told me this story. He said, let me tell you a story. about why I'm still doing this. He said, the circus comes to town, elephants and all the animals, and parading down Main Street, and there's this kid who follows the elephants, and his job is to stick his hand up the elephant's rear end and relieve the elephant. And of course, when he does that, the elephant relieves himself all over the kid. So the kid is doing this and up all the way up Main Street, and the circus stops, and someone walks up to the kid and says, "Why in the world would you do that? I mean, that's crazy. That's a crazy job." And the kid looks at him and says, "And give up showbiz?"
That's a great joke.
Really is. Well, let me ask you this now, and Fred's attitude toward the whole thing. Trial lawyers have evolved over the years. You brushed on it. This period coming out of World War II when it was a young profession. What kind of a role does Fred play in that, and his attitude towards this evolution?
Well, his evolution as a lawyer has gone from personal injury law to now to mass tort law. So I think to take a wider lens to this, I mean, he built a small Pensacola plaintiffs law firm into one of the biggest mass torts firms in the country. One of the four largest. They represent all of the claimants in the BP litigation against BP. And his ability to build his law firm allowed them to pivot into that world. And that world really today is the only place where average people go to seek justice when they're wronged by drug companies or big corporations or banks. So I think that really has been his lasting contribution to law.
He raised a lot of eyebrows, and it was controversial. He gave $10 million to the University of Florida, where we now have the Frederick G. Levin College of Law. Tell us that story.
Well, Fred gave the money after the big tobacco settlement, in which he helped bring big tobacco to its knees. But like everything with Fred Levin, there's two sides to every story. He gave the money because he had the money, and he went to the University of Florida Law School. His son went to the University of Florida. His daughter graduated from that law school, and it held a special place in his heart. But yet at the same time, for Fred's entire career, the blue blood corporate lawyers were always on him. They were always, putting him down. They were always criticizing him, no matter what he did, no matter how successful he became. And so he decided he wanted to stick it to him. And one way to stick it to him was to put his name on their law school. 75% of the lawyers in their firms went to the University of Florida. Their grandchildren are going to go to the University of Florida. So Fred said, you know what? I'm going to put my name on that law school, and when their grandchild graduates, my name is going to be on his diploma.
I love it.
That's great.
Fred Levin.
That's a wonderful story. Let us kind of recap here a little bit. We are chatting with Josh Young, a 5-time New York Times best-selling author. His brand new book is from Ben Bella Books Incorporated, and Give Up Showbiz. It is the story of Fred Levin, native of Pensacola. This is the gentleman who brought big tobacco to its knees in the state of Florida a number of years ago. I think the verdict was somewhere around $200 million. We want to find out how Lawton Childs decided to go to Fred Levin and hear more of this story of this big tobacco settlement. You are listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And our conversation with Josh Young will continue following these messages. From Pensacola to Key West and all points in between, you're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and in the Orlando area of Tuff TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry, Reagan. It's great to have Josh here with us. Thank you, Josh, for coming on.
You're welcome.
That is Josh Young and his brand new book, And Give Up Showbiz.
Now, Fred Levin, obviously, now I know the Levin from the Florida Law School name. See, now this is the same guy. Let's talk about that big tobacco case that people are still talking about. Let's give us some background on there, if you will, and then how he was able to successfully sue big tobacco in Florida.
Yeah, sure. It began in Mississippi when a lawyer named Ron Motley came up to Fred one night at the bar and said, we're going to sue Big Tobacco for all the damage they've done to Medicaid patients in this state, and we want you to do the same in Florida. And Fred took a sip of his Crown Royal and looked at Ron Motley and said, you're out of your mind. These guys have never paid a nickel. You're never going to get anywhere with this. You're going to waste a lot of money. Forget it. Well, Fred went back to Florida, and his natural curiosity took over. He began leafing through law books, and he found a very obscure statute in the Florida law canon that was called the Third Party Recovery Act. And he determined that if he could change a few words in this law, that the state of Florida could, in fact, sue Big Tobacco on behalf of all the Medicaid patients who had been harmed by cigarettes. And the trick in this, from a legal point of view, was that changing the law would allow the state of Florida to stand in the shoes of the smokers rather than having to go one smoker at a time in a lawsuit. So Fred then went to Lawton Childs, the governor, and told him this idea. Lawton Childs thought it was a fantastic idea. He said, those guys hooked me when I was a kid. Let's get them. Fred then went to W.D. Childers, who was the president of the state senate, a very close friend of Fred's, and Fred was a special counsel to W.D. And he said, I've rewritten this law. You got to get it passed. W.D. said, no problem. So in the spring session, in the middle of the night, at 1 o'clock in the morning, when the last vote was taken, W.D. proposed changing this law, the wording in this law, and he passed it on a voice vote. Nobody had any idea what was going on. They didn't mention Big Tobacco in the law. It was just a very simple pivot. About 2-3 days later, everybody figured this out. Big Tobacco figured it out. The lawyers went nuts. The lobbyists went nuts. Everybody went nuts. And at that point, it allowed the state to get standing. The state sued the big tobacco companies on behalf of all the Medicaid patients to recover the $13 billion that they had spent. Big Tobacco obviously challenged this law all the way up to the Supreme Court. Law ended up being upheld, and so they had to settle the case. That then led to every single state settling with Big Tobacco in the global $260 billion settlement.
So it was a $260 billion settlement. What year was this? Did this all happen?
So the Florida state case was filed in 97 and settled in 99, and then it was over the course of probably the next 4 or 5 years that all of the other states fell in line and settled.
What the relationship was there any kind of special relationship between Fred and Lawton Childs at all, or?
Yeah, I think he was close. He knew Lawton through W.D. Childers and through his through his philanthropic work, frankly, and through his status. Fred had been for 2 or 3 years the special counsel to W.D. Childers, and I believe that's how he came to know Lawton well.
A little bit off the track here, but I wanted to ask you about it. Fred also is involved with Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Yeah, Bobby Kennedy Jr. is a law partner at Levin Papantonio, Fred's law firm. He specializes in environmental cases, and with Fred's partner, Mike Papantonio, he has won several significant environmental cases over the past 8 or 10 years.
This man has done so many incredible things, and I wanted to ask you too. We have heard that Fred was paid $5 million on Johnny Cochran's life insurance policy. Now, how in the world could that happen?
This is another amazing Fred Levin story. It's sort of every time Fred does good, he does well for himself. Fred had this idea to start a national law firm with Johnny Cochran after Johnny became famous for getting O.J. Simpson acquitted, frankly. So they started the law firm, the Cochran firm, still in existence today. It started in Washington, D.C. and Memphis. And Fred, once the firm was started, Fred and the other lawyers who came up with the idea said, look, we need to have a life insurance policy on Johnny, a key man clause, because without him, without his face on the door, we have no law firm. So they took out a $50 million life insurance policy on Johnny. At the time, Johnny joked he wasn't terribly comfortable having 4 white men who controlled his airplane having a $50 million life insurance policy on him, but nonetheless, he went along with it. Well, 2 years and 1 day after, so during the time of the policy, Johnny developed brain cancer. 2 years and 1 day after the policy was taken out, Johnny Cochran died. A life insurance policy could not be contested after the 2-year anniversary, so the policy paid out. Johnny's widow
by one day.
By one day. Johnny's widow got $25 million, so she was well taken care of. The law partners who worked at the firm got $15 million, and the 3 guys, one of whom was Fred, each received $5 million.
Well, it's funny because the law firm still exists without Johnny Cochran, which is kind of unusual.
Yeah, I think it went on because the partners who started this firm really have a strong personal constitution for protecting people's liberties, and they weren't about to let that go. The firm was also doing great business at that point. It was expanding across the country. They must have 18, 20 offices now beyond the initial Washington and Memphis offices. And all you have to do is turn on your television, watch cable TV to know they're going strong.
Really?
Well, I want to ask you this: how did Fred avoid 2 murder prosecutions? Tell us a little background on that.
Well, these I'm going to defer everyone to the book. Please
Okay.
buy the book and read these stories because they're outstanding, and there is absolutely no way to sum them up because they are so complicated and so absolutely bizarre that they could have only
All right.
to Fred
Well,
Levin.
we will defer to the book on that. How about when he became the chief of Ghana?
That came out of a situation where he had become a boxing manager. Fred represented the boxer Roy Jones Jr. For many years. And in the course of that, a man named Ike Corte came to him. Ike Corte is the Michael Jordan of Ghana. He's a boxer. He wasn't being paid fairly or treated fairly by boxing, so he wanted Fred to represent him. Fred took over, represented him, ended up raising his take from $50,000 to over $1 million a fight. And during this time, he became acquainted with the royal family of Ghana because of Ike Corte's position in the country. And they really respected a lot of what Fred had done for African Americans, not only winning verdicts, but donating money and being involved in their community. Fred was so they asked Fred if he would become a chief of Ghana, and he became the 3rd American to be named a chief of Ghana, the other 2 being Shirley Temple Black and Congressman Barbara Jordan of Texas.
Wow. Fred has known as many as 5 men who could have become president of the United States. How come Fred never went into politics?
No, who have not become.
Right.
So this is another little thing here that attracted me to the story. We all know people who are wealthy and leaders in their field. They all end up knowing politicians and like Bill Clinton, and they get to sleep in the Lincoln bedroom. We read about that for years and years. Well, all of the guys who Fred knew almost made it, but none of them actually made it. Gary Hart, John Edwards. I mean, it's almost like you can't make this up. So there was this element of like Fred getting so close to being able to be friends with the president, but none of the horses he bet on made it.
So why didn't he go into politics?
Oh, because the first press conference would be the end of the campaign. Let him speak his mind, and there is no way that he could survive any sort of media questioning or public forums like that.
Oh, yeah,
Now,
I can understand.
You say that Fred's own son, and I quote here, calls him a cockroach and a humanitarian. We need to hear that one.
Yes, and well, it's interesting because you can't kill the cockroach. So they're going to stay around forever. They're going to survive all of us, the nuclear attack and whatnot. But in this case, he's referring to Fred as a lawyer who can't be taken down. He's going to continue to fight these cases. He's going to continue to win these cases, no matter what forces are allied against him, what corporate blue blood lawyers, what politicians, any forces. So he is going to continue to survive. And the irony is when you call someone a cockroach, it's sort of a negative, obviously a negative thing, but at the same time, he's a humanitarian in that he continues to give back, to fight for victims' rights for young people, to give money to the University of Florida Law School, to give money to those Northwest Florida charities that he does. So there's this sort of push-pull to everything he does and to everything he represents. So while you may think he's kind of vile and kind of money-grubbing, he does a lot of good.
We are chatting with Josh Young. He is the author of And Give Up Showbiz. It is the story of Fred Levin, native of Pensacola, and the man who beat big tobacco here in Florida. Lots more things that he have done that, the Florida Trend called him a renegade among renegades. So we're going to find out about that. Let us remind you that this is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and of Tuff TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And our conversation continues following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and in the Orlando area on Tuff TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day, New York Times bestselling author Josh Young. We are talking about his brand new book, And Give Up Showbiz, the story of Fred Levin, and my goodness, all of the unique things that he has done over the years. Fred, now in his late 70s, a Florida native. Florida Trend magazine, Josh, called Fred a renegade among renegades. Does that suit him?
I think it does. I think in his profession, he has distinguished himself beyond what many, many other lawyers have for the types of cases he's won, the types of verdicts he's won, but also the type of good he's done. We talked about earlier the big tobacco settlement. I mean, that's been called one of the most important pieces of healthcare legislation in the country, this law that he rewrote and changed that allowed Florida to sue, and that's saved almost 100,000 lives a year. So while other lawyers other renegade lawyers tend to focus on what they have done for themselves and their clients, I think there's a sort of a larger picture to what Fred has done. And I think that's to what they were referring.
Let's talk about, you said that wasn't much of a family man. We could delve a little bit into that as well. Some of those interesting asides.
Yeah, well, Fred believed that his job was to provide financially for his family, which he did beyond anything. But of 17 graduations, high school, college, and law school, of his own children, he only attended one. Mm-hmm. And that was because he was forced. His daughter, Marcy, who's now a circuit court judge in Pensacola, graduated from law school at Vanderbilt. Fred went to the Kentucky Derby. You know, this was not a thing for him. But there's actually a story that sort of points to this, and I'll tell it briefly. Fred's son Martin was on the basketball team in the 8th grade, and Daddy, got to come to the game. Daddy, you've never been to a game. No, I don't want to go. I got drinks with the boys. Forget it. No, I'm not doing that. Daddy, please. So Fred goes to the game. Fred's bought the uniforms for the team. He supports the team. He's watching the game. Game unfolds. End of the 4th quarter. His son is riding the bench the entire game. Fred is glaring at the coach. The coach sees this. He's like, I got to put the Levin kid in. It's a 1-point game. He puts Martin Levin in. That Martin's team is winning by 1 point. Martin grabs the ball, gets the ball, runs up the court, throws in a layup. Beautiful moment. Looks at his dad, pumps his fists, raises his thumbs. Unfortunately, he scored in the other team's basket, and the other team now won the game. Fred stomps out of the basketball game and never goes to another event again.
Wow, that is some interesting story.
Amazing. Well, over the years, Fred has been photographed with the likes of Bill Clinton, Bob Hope, Colin Powell, Muhammad Ali, Don King, Mikhail Gorbachev. The list seems almost endless. Does that also play into the title of your book, Give Up Show Business? Is it all show business to him?
No, I think ultimately it's not. I think there's a large element of showbiz, and there's the thrill of being in the courtroom and the thrill of knowing, having met Bill Clinton and Mikhail Gorbachev and Muhammad Ali and sort of an endless string of fancy people. But, at the core, there's something interesting about him is that he treats everyone the same. He treats Bill Clinton and Muhammad Ali the same way he treats the guy who cuts his lawn or the waiter or the guy who drives the airport rental car bus. I've traveled with him and I've seen this, and that's sort of a unique thing that I don't think a lot of people in his position can say.
We have just about a minute here, Josh. If you can, briefly, the experience with anti-Semitism, the influence on his career.
Yeah, ironically, it was a driver that really helped him succeed and didn't hold him back, which is unusual. The fact that he wasn't able to join the country club and wasn't able to join sororities and was ostracized because he was Jewish drove him very hard and probably accounts for a great deal of his success.
Well, it certainly is a unique book, and we presume that it is available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and places like Amazon.com.
It is.
So, Josh, does Fred live here in Florida still?
Fred lives in Pensacola. He'll never leave Pensacola.
That's his
Grew up
place.
there, still lives there.
That is a marvelous, marvelous story. Josh Young, 5-time New York Times bestselling author, the new book, And Give Up Showbiz, How Fred Levin Beat Big Tobacco, Avoided 2 murder prosecutions, Became a Chief of Ghana, Earned Boxing Manager of the Year, and transformed American law. It is truly a unique American success story, and we're proud to call Fred a native of Florida and still have him residing here in our state. Maybe we're on about a half a dozen stations in Pensacola. Maybe he may even hear this, Josh.
That would be terrific.
It is. We hope that you folks will pick this up and give it a good read. It gets 5 stars from here. It is a marvelous, marvelous book from Ben Bella Publishing, and again, available at all the fine bookstores and Amazon.com, places like that. And Josh, we hope you'll come back and do this again when the next one's ready.
I will. Thanks, Reagan. I appreciate it.
It has been a delight to have you. You are listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area of Tuff TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And we'll have a closing thought in a moment. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And a pleasure to have Josh Young with us, well-spoken young man, New York Times bestselling author, and Give Up Showbiz, the story of Florida's own Fred Levin. Wow. I hope you give it a good read. It's a great book.
Yeah, it was fun interviewing Josh.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, you're making the point, Reagan, that it's not good to talk about the president, and people are shying away. Let's talk a little bit about that.
In the closing days of the campaign, Barack Obama was out on the campaign trail, but it was pointed out that the only places he was campaigning were like in high school auditoriums in precincts where he had carried 99% of the vote 2 years ago. And of course, now what that says is that they're trying to turn out those supporters, those people who were for him, and where he did very, very well. In general, in the major cities and places along the campaign trail, the Democrat candidates were running away from him as opposed to running with him.
Yeah, and I don't understand that. I mean, if you look at this administration, you could point to successes if you were a Democrat.
Yeah.
You could say, look, we have health care now. You could say when the Republicans left, the economy was in free fall. Now, look, we have all this many months of job growth. And you could point to all these good things, but why aren't they? Where's the disconnect? Why are voters not responding?
His overall job approval rating is in the dumper.
Is that because people aren't trusting him? Is that what it is?
They don't think he's handling the job well at all.
And is that because the Republicans are good at spinning that fact, or because he's not, or because a combination of both, do you think?
Probably a combination. It lays somewhere in between there, but that's what all the national polling is showing. He is in the dumper, and historically that is what happens to a second-term president. Once you get past, you come down to the last couple of years, and people are saying the country's on the wrong track, we're going on the wrong, we made a mistake.
What's interesting is the Republican obstructionist idea worked.
Yeah.
So if the Republicans did in fact get the Senate, which was likely when we're taping as of today, we're going to see the Democrats do the same thing. They're going to obstruct,
Sure.
and they're going to use all of those techniques that the Republicans just taught them over the last 6 years. So it's going to be interesting.
I thought it was interesting. The column the Sunday before the election, Charles Krauthammer wrote that if the Republicans didn't make a sweep in the Senate, then their leadership needed to start looking for new jobs.
Well, and that's an interesting point. Usually when the president's in power, everybody gets fatigue and they vote the other party in. Of course, nothing really happens, and then they vote the other party in. And of course, we've been doing this now, Reagan, for many decades, and nothing really ever changes in towards good things
in particular,
for the people. So
in the 20th century, the rule pretty much has been, and there are exceptions, pretty much has been 8 years and out. And that has been our pattern of behavior historically for at least the last 60 years or so. So we'll see. But a long road to travel yet. And many conversations to have about this. Next week, Ed Pozzuoli, former GOP state chairman, practicing lawyer, political power in the Fort Lauderdale area, is scheduled to be with us to analyze the election returns. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
We thank you for your company. We'll see you in 1 week with another edition of the Florida Roundtable.